Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. I wanted to mention that I am going to be at Bitcoin Nashville this July, and I've been to the last two conferences. The last two, of course, were in Miami. I will be there in July, and so I always like going and meeting a lot of people. And so if you are there, I hope to see you there. It's really the only the only crypto conference I've even ever been to. Uh, so I do hope to see you guys out in Nashville later on in July. Anyways, Bitcoin coming in at $66,000. A little bit of a downward move here over the last few days, and we talked a lot about this, right? The idea that Bitcoin just simply does, really similar to what it did. Sorry, I've had a spider kind of around my desk recently, but kind of like what it did last summer, where it chops around, and it's while it chops around that the dominance of Bitcoin just shoots up, right? Because again, the same thing happened a year ago, and it's interesting. The reason why it happens, I think, is because social interest really sort of falls off. Right, social interest really falls off as you get into the summer months, and while that happens, when sort of the bid for altcoins starts to disappear a little bit, the altcoins really capitulate against Bitcoin. The Bitcoin dominance goes higher, and so when you look at it like this, you can see that last summer, really starting in April, but really going, for a lot of the summer, the Bitcoin dominance was going up. Right, and you're kind of seeing something happen over here as well, right? I mean, like Bitcoin's just chopping around, but the dominance has been slowly going higher. So what I think is happening is that Bitcoin is absorbing that liquidity from the rest of the market. Now, of course, you have other things that are providing liquidity as well. It's not just the altcoin market. I always see a couple people say that, and I just want to be clear. I am fully aware. In fact, if you go over to the total Bitcoin spot ETF holdings, I mean, you can see that they have gone higher. It is a little, but look, this is something that I think has gotten a lot of people off sides. They look at these charts and like, well, if the spot ETFs are going to new highs in terms of holdings, why is Bitcoin not going to all-time highs? They say it must be a manipulation, right? Guys, it's a market, right? I mean, you don't hear people scream manipulation when the price is going up. You shouldn't scream it when the price is not going up, right? It is just a market. And if anything, these sorts of charts should suggest to you that maybe the market is bigger than just simply looking at ETF flows. Again, that's not to say that Bitcoin can't eventually go higher, but the point is that there are other sources of liquidity than just people putting their money into spot ETFs, right? There's also the people that just buy it through an exchange. Again, if you're putting your money in a spot ETF, you're paying a fee. Now, some people are probably fine with that. And look, who am I to say anything about where you want to custody your Bitcoin? My only point is that Bitcoin, it's really interesting. Like, it's a confusing thing I think, if you really think about it, because for 10 years, it was always not your keys, not your Bitcoin. Not your keys, not your Bitcoin. Everyone preaches it. And then 2021 happens, and you get all these, the Celsius, all these other places that offer interest on it, and then people are fine putting their Bitcoin elsewhere. And I mean, it's okay. Like, it's okay to learn a lesson. We all learn lessons. I've learned plenty of lessons myself throughout the years. And I get things wrong absolutely all the time. I've made so many mistakes. I try to do the best I can of learning from them, but I'm not perfect. But it's like, guys, in 2021, if you hadn't already learned it, or in 2022, I should say, if you hadn't already learned it, not your keys, not your Bitcoin, you understood what it meant then, and so did everyone else. And then 2024 rolls around, and everyone just can't get enough of the spot ETFs. And I guess, it really does go to show that people are not in it for the tech as much as they say, because if they were, why would they be shilling spot ETFs where you don't even own the keys to your Bitcoin, while simultaneously saying the reason they like Bitcoin is because you get to, hold the keys to it, right? They're celebrating the spot ETFs because it means more money's coming in, which is funny because I've never shied away from saying the reason, I'm in the cryptoverse, right? I'm not here just to celebrate the technology. We're all here to make money. Let's be honest, right? I mean, you're not going around and looking at all these meme coins doing everything and everyone chasing those because they're in it for the tech. No, they want to make money. They want to get into the meme coin early so they can sell it to a bag holder later on. That's what they do. So again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing to cheer on the spot ETF flows, but don't on one hand say not your keys, not your Bitcoin, and then on the other hand only ever be fascinated with the people that are putting their money into these spot ETFs. And this right here, I mean, it really does go to show. And by the way, I mean, my official position on this is that you should hold the keys to your Bitcoin. If you're someone that you don't want to be responsible for it, you just know yourself and you're like, oh, I'll lose the keys, I would just rather have someone else custody it. Look, I'm not going to go on a spiel every single time, right? My own personal opinion, not your keys, not your Bitcoin. So, I mean, if something happens eventually, you knew the risk going in. Hopefully nothing does. Hopefully things are better now. I think there's a much higher chance today that that it's a little bit better than what we had back in 2021. But even then, there's always going to be a risk. And there was a risk in 2021, and then people found out the hard way in 2022 what that risk was. But when you look at a chart like this and you see that these spot ETF flows have hit new highs, or the holdings in the spot ETFs have hit new highs, and then you're like, well, why hasn't Bitcoin, right? You're looking at it and like, well, the spot ETF flows have, what's going on with Bitcoin? Why has it not? Perhaps the reason is just simply because there's more to the market than the ETFs, right? Bitcoin existed for 13 years, more than 13 years. We have price history going back to 2011. Actually, we have price history going back to 2010. Some places you can find it going all the way back to 2009. But I guess we really had it for about 14, 15 years or so before the spot ETFs were even launched. And so, there's more to the cryptoverse than the spot ETFs. And so, yes, I mean, it's you're witnessing more money come in by looking at the spot ETFs and seeing the holdings. Doesn't necessarily always mean that Bitcoin goes immediately to new highs. And again, one of the reasons I think is because the altcoin market, as I've said 1,000 times and in 1,000 different videos, essentially, is that the altcoin market is kind of sitting at a major support level, which, as I've said before, I think is going to break to the downside, because I do think at the end of the day, alt Bitcoin pairs are oscillators at best, meaning that altcoins at some point are going to capitulate down to the range lows. That's my opinion. I don't know exactly when it's going to be, but I do know that there are a lot of similarities between the summer of 2019 and the summer of 2024 in terms of, we're just before the Fed cuts, probably sometime later this year. And social interest saw a spike earlier in the year, just like it did in 2019. If you were to go over to the social risk, just like in 2019, you saw a spike in social interest and then it came back down. Same thing over here, right? A spike up going into the halving, and then it came back down. And it was over here where we saw alt Bitcoin pairs bottom out. And so I think that could be one of the reasons why you haven't seen new highs, is because one of the major sources of liquidity for Bitcoin has been, it's not the only source, but it has been this source of altcoin liquidity. And the altcoin market, again, hasn't really been doing that well. And one way to sort of visualize that is to look at the advanced decline index, right? The advanced decline index shows you how it's just been capitulating recently, right? There's a lot more cryptocurrencies are going down than going up. But guess what? Bitcoin has been holding on a lot better than most altcoins, right? And again, just to go through the list, Ethereum is obviously doing better than most alts. ADA below the 20-week SMA. Polkadot below the 20-week SMA. Avalanche below the 20-week. Matic below the 20-week. XRP below the 20-week. Link below it. BNB above it, right? So there's some that are above it. Solana is still slightly, it's below the 20-week, above the 21-week EMA. Doge, slightly below it. Litecoin, below it. Uni, slightly above it. What do you see? You see a lot of these altcoins are below their 20-week moving average. Now, if you go over to Total 3 is below the 20-week SMA, but it's still above the 21-week EMA. You see? Now look at Bitcoin's chart. This is why we've been preaching Bitcoin dominance for years. If Bitcoin goes up, Bitcoin dominance goes up, theoretically. If Bitcoin goes down, Bitcoin dominance goes up, so long as Bitcoin is above the 20-week moving average. Once Bitcoin goes below the 20-week moving average, it's possible that the Bitcoin dominance has at least locally topped, if not globally topped for the market cycle, or close to it. But we haven't seen that yet, right? Bitcoin is still sort of sloshing around between 60 and 70K, just like in 2019, where it was just moving around between, 9K and 14K. And while it did that, Bitcoin dominance went up and altcoins went down. In fact, altcoins got pinned beneath their bull market support band before Bitcoin fell below its bull market support band. See, Bitcoin fell below its 20-week SMA in September, but altcoins fell below it in July, right after alt Bitcoin pairs broke down in June. Now, again, you can compare this to this right here, or maybe you want to compare it to here. It's a tough call, right? And I think your version of what makes more sense is going to be dependent on whether you think Bitcoin valuations are more important or USD valuations are more important. I prefer to measure the Cryptoverse through its Bitcoin pair, through its Satoshi valuation. Because at the end of the day, if you're buying an altcoin and all it's doing is bleeding back to the king, a lower risk asset, then I don't know what you're doing. You're doing something wrong. And I look at the chart, and because I care about the Bitcoin valuation, I look at it and say, well, if altcoins are oscillators at best, which I think they are, we're still off the range low, right? There's this gap here that needs to get filled to the downside, right? For altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. And I don't make any apologies for it. For, the people that have doubted the Bitcoin dominance, they've had to eat humble pie more than a few times. But guess what? I'll let you in a little secret. Everyone has, right? I've had to eat it a lot too. Let's be fair. But the Bitcoin dominance has just continued to go up higher and higher and higher. And there's so many things we went into this year with saying that these are the things that are going to happen more than likely, but not necessarily in this order. And one of those things, if you guys remember, was that that gold would break out. You guys remember that? And what's fascinating about this is that gold broke out in 2019 as well. And I know people are like, well, this time's different. And I'm like, is it? Maybe it is. I know a lot of people that I respect are calling for higher prices really, really soon. And it's possible that happens. In mid-2019, in June, in fact, Bitcoin went to a new high, a new local high. It wasn't an all-time high, but it did go to a new high for the year. And even in last year, in late June, early July, we saw Bitcoin go to new yearly highs. So I'm not going to sit here and say it can't happen, but I would simply point out, right? Just simply point out that gold broke out right here in 2019, and that's ultimately where the Bitcoin correction started from. And I know people are saying this time is different, right? And I get it. They could be right. I'm not here to say that my view is correct. It very well might not be. But there's this part of me that's like, it hasn't deviated yet, right? If you look at gold, right? If you just say, all right, well, here's gold. When did it break out? All right, it broke out right here in late February, early March, right? That's essentially where Bitcoin found a local top, And I know it's like, well, is it different? Is it not? I can assure you in 2019, it's not like we knew that 14K was the top for the next 12 months or longer. because it worked its way down so slowly, right? When you look at this, what happened? Bitcoin put in a high in June, and then a lower high in July, and then a lower high in August. It was a high and then two lower highs, right? June, July, August. And I've pointed this out before as well. Here, you have the same thing, right? You have March, April, May. All lower highs, I believe. Maybe even going into June. I don't know where the wick went exactly. And I think it might depend on the exchange you use. And this is an index. If you go to, say, one of the exchanges, here's Coinbase, you can see that the high in March of 2024 was 73,835. The high in April was 72,777. The high in May was 71,980. And the high in June was 71,974. So I'm like, there's part of me that I feel, I'm like, well, it hasn't deviated just yet. And so I want to be open-minded to that comparison, even though it's a really difficult thing to sort of ring the bell on, because I know at any time Bitcoin could just make a run for a new high and sort of invalidate that. But at this point, we said in 2019, gold broke out, and when it did, Bitcoin struggled for a little bit. And that's where Bitcoin dominance soared. That's where alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, right? Now remember, last cycle though, when gold broke out, Bitcoin USD when gold broke out, alt Bitcoin pairs immediately broke down. This cycle, we didn't see that, right? We saw gold break out, and we've seen Bitcoin at least hit a local top. Not to say that it can't go higher. It hit a local top, but we didn't really see alt Bitcoin pairs break down in the same way. Because when gold broke out in June of 2019, that's precisely when alt Bitcoin pairs broke down. This time around, we haven't really seen that. We've seen alt Bitcoin pairs hold a lot longer, but right now they're sitting at 0.39, right? So maybe they're in the process of breaking down. In fact, it was in 2019 in June when they broke down. When the social risk was extremely low and no one cared about the markets. That was when alt Bitcoin pairs finally dropped. And the other thing we said to look at is the blue chip dominance, the Bitcoin plus ETH dominance, to get a weekly close above 73% this year and trend higher and potentially go all the way up to 80%. Now it's gotten that weekly close above 73% after taking for what seemed like forever. Guess what? It's now up here. It broke through. We said look for Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance to get a weekly close above 61%. That hasn't happened yet, right? That hasn't happened. So some of these things have happened. Some of them haven't. I said others Bitcoin is likely going to go back down and take out these lows. And you can see that it really, ever since 2024 began, it's been going lower. If you were to look at total 3, others divided by total 3 minus others. So we're basically just looking at low cap alts versus higher market cap alts. Lower market cap alts are really underperforming higher market cap alts right now. It almost looks like similar to what we saw back over here, where it might be about to fall off a cliff, where lower market cap alts, your meme coins that everyone's chasing, maybe they get a larger correction this summer, especially relative to the larger market cap alts. The other thing that I've mentioned many, many times was the USDT dominance, right? USDT dominance. To go around 4%. And we saw that, right? It went around 4%. It went below 4%, went back to the trend line. The other thing that I mentioned was Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance, which I know I already mentioned earlier, but it is at that same level that it was at just before, in June of 2019. In fact, in June of 2019, the week of, say, June 17th, this is where Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance was. Same time of the year. And I'm like, well, why? What if it just breaks to the upside just like it did back then, which it looks like it's about to do? I know the Bitcoin dominant stuff, the alt Bitcoin pair stuff, it's not what people really want to talk about. They want to talk about the meme coins and the flashy stuff. But Bitcoin dominance has never really stopped going up ever since this entire thing began. ever since we really started to focus on it more, it never really has stopped going up. It's reached points many times where people thought that it had topped out, but then a few months later, it just puts in a new high. Why can't it do the same thing again? All it would really take is all Bitcoin pairs to drop. In fact, if you were to look at Bitcoin divided by total minus ETH, so this is Bitcoin dominance excluding ETH, you can't even really see a point since April where it really came off of its uptrend. The change in heart by the SEC for ETH occurred in May, right? Wasn't it May? About mid-May or so. That's when ETH USD spiked. But you can see that even though ETH USD spiked, the Bitcoin dominance excluding ETH just kind of kept on going up. In fact, it's almost about to hit a new cycle high right now. The high excluding ETH is around 68%. It's at 68% right now, right? It's not that far off. So while Bitcoin dominance is not back to 57%, it's still actually less than 56%. The only real reason is because of ETH Bitcoin. The altcoin market is about to break support, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because last cycle altcoins broke support against Bitcoin 2 weeks before ETH Bitcoin broke support. And perhaps it's this spot ETF stuff for ETH, which is going to be the narrative for maybe why it holds up a little bit longer than the altcoin market, but there's always a reason why. There's always a narrative to accompany it. And you know what? Despite the fact that the spot ETF has sort of stolen the spotlight for a little while for ETH Bitcoin, how do we know it's not just doing the same thing it did in 2019, where it just prints lower highs in January, February, and March, just like here, January, February, and March? How do we know it's just not the same damn thing? Maybe it's not, maybe it is. I would say, you know what? I want to be open-minded. The reason why I still think it's going to bleed is because monetary policy hasn't changed. If you were to look at U.S. interest rates, we know last cycle ETH Bitcoin didn't bottom until after the Fed cut rates. We know last cycle that ETH Bitcoin didn't bottom until after quantitative tightening ended, neither of which has happened yet. So I can't be compelled to change my view on ETH Bitcoin just because a spot ETF launched, especially, or just because it's probably going to launch soon, especially since Bitcoin's already got one. Now, maybe if Bitcoin didn't have one, I don't know, right? All I'm saying is that it's so far not different. You've seen gold break out. We've seen ETH Bitcoin put in lower highs. If ETH Bitcoin holds above the bull market support band through July on weekly closes, then maybe I would change my mind about it, right? But if you've been following me for the last 2 years on ETH Bitcoin, the last 2.5 years really, and if you've been following me on this, and you know the reason why I've been bearish on ETH Bitcoin in the first place, you'd be very confused if I just said, hey, I think it's going to go up, just simply because a spot ETF launched. I mean, Bitcoin has one too, right? And I'm not convinced that ETH is going to attract more flows than Bitcoin is. I think Bitcoin's probably going to exceed what the flows look like for ETH, especially during a phase where monetary policy is so restrictive. Now, once it becomes less restrictive, maybe ETH would start to gain an edge, and that's where ETH Bitcoin would likely start to outperform. But perhaps the test, the 2019 test, is to see, does ETH Bitcoin go back down to the range low by late June, early July? Because guess what? It's not that far away from it right now. It would only have to drop from the current valuation, right? It would only have to drop another 7%. And it's back down to the June 2022 low. So we've seen these things happen, right? Like we've seen a lot of the things we said coming into this year, we've seen play out, right? Bitcoin dominance has put in new highs, right? And a lot of people thought it had topped back at the spot ETF. We said, no, it'll likely get another rally into the halving. And it did. Then after the halving, I said, right, that it's still likely going to keep going up because of monetary policy. And it looks like it is. And I know a few weeks ago, everyone was dunking on it because of the spot ETF. And they're like, well, look at it. Yeah, look at it. It still held support at the bull market support band. The same level that it's been holding support out more or less with a couple of fake outs since 2022, the end of 2022. In fact, if you were to look again at monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, you can't find a single red monthly Heikin-Ashi candle for Bitcoin dominance since November of 2022. And there have been people that have faded this entire move by Bitcoin dominance because they failed to account for the effects of monetary policy on the cryptoverse. So I look at Bitcoin USD right now, and I think there's a decent chance it could fade back into the bull market support band. You can see that it did the same thing last year, right? I think it could go back to that 20-week SMA. And if it falls below the 20-week SMA, it might be after Bitcoin dominance theoretically tops, right? That's what happened in 2019. Bitcoin dominance topped, then Bitcoin fell below the 20-week moving average. But not until Bitcoin dominance topped. It makes sense when you think about it. Why? Because if Bitcoin dominance tops, it's usually right around the time of a Fed pivot. But if the Fed pivots, then people start to take more risk with lower market cap things. Therefore, people divert their funds away from just the blue chips to higher risk stuff because those funds get diverted. The lower market cap stuff, while it bottoms against Bitcoin, it goes down commensurate with Bitcoin USD. And it makes sense that Bitcoin USD stays stronger than alts for a longer period of time because there's probably a lot of people just converting their alts to Bitcoin, right? Whether it's their ETH, their ADA, their DOT, their Avalanche, their Matic, their XRP, their Link, whatever. There's a lot of people that are probably just converting their alts to Bitcoin. There's not a lot of people that are all converting their alts to some other coin, right? Like, maybe there's someone out there that's converting their AVAX to Matic or their XRP to Link, but there's not going to be, you're not going to have that same funnel from every single coin where there's people from every single coin likely taking profits back to Bitcoin. That's why Bitcoin held up longer in 2019 than the altcoin market, because you can see that Bitcoin didn't fall below the 20-week SMA until September, but in 2019, altcoins fell below it in July, right? And again, maybe you think we're here, and I could be on board with that view, but the reason why I keep looking at this one is because of alt Bitcoin pairs. If I weren't cursed with thinking of the market in terms of its Bitcoin valuation, I wouldn't be looking at this chart. But when I look at this chart, I have to go back to the prior time where it looked like this, and the only time it ever looked like this was in June of 2019, when it had been holding support for almost a year at around the same valuation that it is today, and just before the Fed cut rates. So how can I turn a blind eye to it? I can't. So I think that if Bitcoin goes up and it puts in a new high, Bitcoin dominance goes up because every time it's rallied, that's what Bitcoin dominance has done. I also think that if Bitcoin drops back down to the 20-week SMA, Bitcoin dominance goes up because every time it gets a correction, every time Bitcoin coughs, the altcoin market catches pneumonia. That's why you're seeing Bitcoin right now still several percentage points above the 20-week SMA, but guess what? Altcoins are already below their 20-week moving average at the time of this video. They're weaker, right? And if Bitcoin drops back to the bull market support band, alts are probably below it, right? So Bitcoin right now, though, isn't even at its 20-week moving average. In fact, it's trying to hold the 8-week moving average as support. The 8-week moving average is around 65.9K. So we just saw Bitcoin wick below the 8-week, but now it's right back above it. So are we kind of doing this, right? Is that where we are? Similar type of time during the year. Bitcoin's just slowly going down, but it's not really dropping a lot. And you can see that over here, Bitcoin had some spikes. And one of those spikes took out all these prior highs. And that spike didn't occur until July 10th. You're getting some spikes over here as well, but so far they've just been lower highs. They haven't actually put in a new high. But even if they did put in a new high, I mean, unless it actually rallies all the way up to much higher prices, who cares, right? It's still just a cool off phase. So just keep an eye on that, keep an eye on that and see, is it doing something very similar or is it deviating? And so far, it just looks like a really similar type of move. keep an eye on that 8-week SMA. If it falls below the 8-week SMA, remember what normally happens after Bitcoin falls below the 8-week SMA, it goes to the bull market support band or it gets pretty close to it. So that's what you should look for if there's a weekly close below $66,000. So that's where we stand with, with these charts. Of course, we could go look at a few other things, right? You could go look at cycle ROI as measured from the peak. And if you measure it from peak to peak, you can see that we're still pretty far ahead of where we were the last 2 cycles. You could see a drop and we'd still be in line with where we were the last 2 cycles. If you measure it from April, you could see we're a lot further along and maybe it matches up a little bit better. I tend to want to measure it from the actual all-time high than sort of the fake all-time high because price action is king, whatever the indicator says. All models are wrong, some are useful. But there it is. If you measure it from the low, obviously it looks a bit different. But even then, it's still ahead of the last 2 cycles. So, I mean, again, like you can look at the market a ton of different ways. My point is that last cycle, in terms of monetary policy, what we saw happen is we saw Bitcoin go sideways for a few months in the summer. We saw altcoins bleed back to it, exactly how they're doing now. We saw Bitcoin dominance top, and then right after it topped, Bitcoin then fell below the 20-week SMA. But it was a long process. Right? It was a long process, and I don't know how long, even if I'm right about the process, I don't know exactly how long it would take. Last year, after Bitcoin had this surge in mid-June, we didn't get the drop below the 20-week SMA until 2 months later. So who knows, right? Who knows how long the process could take, but it is something to at least think about. That's my dubious speculation on Bitcoin. I don't want to go on too much longer. We'll see how these things play out in the summer. I would mostly just keep an eye on your Bitcoin dominance. As I've said before, I think Bitcoin is going to offer the better risk-adjusted returns. It doesn't mean Bitcoin can't go down. It's just that if it does go down, it's probably going to hold up better than the altcoin market, at least until Bitcoin dominance tops. And I don't think Bitcoin dominance is topping until it hits 60% at least. That's my base case, is 60% Bitcoin dominance for a theoretical top. But I also would sort of defer to changes in monetary policy to really cement that. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. And also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.